The opening scene of the movie depicts a botanical laboratory where a group of researchers are engaged in a discussion about a new species of genetically engineered plants. And according to the scientists, these plants are species that are capable of producing a unique scent that can induce happiness in its owner. And as the discussion continues, the lead scientists explain that the plant requires love and attention, which stimulates the production of a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is often referred to as the mother hormone and has been proven to possess antidepressant properties. And this information intrigues the other scientists, who ask if the plant could be showcased in an upcoming plant exhibition. And Alice and Chris confirm that the plant will indeed be available for exhibition. And later on, we see Alice in her office where her son Joe is waiting for her. And Chris approaches Joe, assuring him that Alice won't be long, and Joe responds sarcastically, indicating that he dislikes his mother's work. And subsequently, the movie takes us to Alice and Joe's apartment, where the mother and son are having dinner. And during their conversation, Joe brings up the topic of Alice's work partner, Chris, and he suggests that he might have feelings for her. And Joe believes that Alice should give Chris a chance as he has similar interests and is a better match for her than Joe's father, who she is now divorced from. And in the next scene, Alice is seen attending a therapy session with a psychotherapist, and she expresses her concern and her success with the plant project, and she also talks about how this success may have affected her relationship with her kid. And the following morning, a group of dedicated scientists, which included Alice and Chris, diligently provided nourishment to the plants. And after adjusting the necessary conditions to optimize the growth process, Chris approaches Alice to express his confidence that the project will be a resounding success. And in one awkward move, he attempts to ask her out and she declines. And she cites her very busy schedule as an excuse and she quickly exits the room. And back at their residence, Alice presents Joe with a strain of plants she's been working on and affectionately named Little Joe. And the two of them spend some quality time together discussing the potential benefits of the plant and their future plans for it. And the next morning, Chris and his colleagues are jolted by the alarming discovery that the plants that they've been experimenting on are deteriorating. And feeling very concerned, they gather other scientists and Alice, the lead biologist, to discuss this issue. And while brainstorming potential causes, a coworker points the finger at Alice, insinuating that she may have used an unauthorized factor. But Alice vehemently denies the accusation, proposing that the problem may be due to the fact that the plants were engineered to be sterile. And meanwhile, a fellow scientist requests Chris to check on her emotional support dog Bella, who's accidentally locked in the specimen room. And as Chris enters the room, Bella jumps on him, causing him to inhale a lot of aerosol. And ignoring the incident, Chris later convinces Alice to join him for a drink at a local bar. And over drinks, Alice opens up about her ex-husband, Ivan. And Ivan was severely hyperallergic to pollen, and she mentions that she deserves someone who's more compatible with her. And Chris sees this as an opportunity to make a move, but Alice rebuffs his advances, indicating that she's not interested in anything else aside from a friendship. And the next morning, the scientists gather around Bella, who'd bitten her owner and appears to be very distressed. And they try to console the distressed dog while brainstorming ways to improve her condition. And at lunch, Alice and her colleagues discussed Bella's emotional issues and her very self-destructive history. And they started to strategize on ways to offer her emotional support. And in his room, Joe becomes completely absorbed in caring for his new plant, Little Joe. And he talks to the plant and regularly waters it, and he's amazed as to how fast the plant is growing. But as the plant starts to produce pollen, Joe inhales a large amount of it, and this has a significant impact on his behavior. That night, Alice returns home and is met with a distant and cold response from Joe, causing her to be concerned about his well-being. And in the morning, Bella heads to work alone, leaving her furry companion behind. And Alice inquires about her dog, but Bella reveals that she had to put her down. And that night, Bella visits Alice's home to discuss her dog's behavioral change. And Bella shares her theory that Little Joe's pollen could affect the limbic system, which controls emotions, by traveling along the olfactory pathway. The olfactory pathway is basically the nose, by the way. Yeah. And Alice disagrees with this fact and she explains that she genetically engineered the plant and that there's no reason for the oxytocin to cause distrustful behavior. And Bella warns Alice to be cautious about exposing her child to the pollen, suspecting that Chris might have been infected. And the following day, Alice confides in her therapist, reassuring herself that the plant isn't infectious and that Chris is safe. And in the afternoon, the scientists convene to discuss the safety of the Little Joe plant. And while Alice and Chris insist on its safety, Carl and Jasper hesitate to release it to the public. And Alice becomes unsettled by the doubts surrounding Little Joe and decides to review the interviews with human test subjects. And she discovers that the interviews have been tampered with and any negative reviews were omitted. And the scene then shifts to Joe spending time with his father, Ivan, and he takes him fishing, and during their conversation, Ivan notices that Joe's behavior has changed a lot. And he asks Joe if he's interested in any girls in class, and Joe admits that he is. And after dropping off Joe at Alice's, Ivan pulls her aside for a chat, expressing his concern about Joe's behavior. And later that evening, Alice and Joe share a meal, and Joe asks out Alice for a movie, but she declines. And that night, while Alice sleeps, Joe steals her lab keys and meets up with Selma, the girl that he likes, and the two break into Alice's laboratory where they enjoy the flowers' scents and they share a very romantic kiss. And in the morning, Alice and Chris receive a summons to the surveillance room and they're informed that one plant was missing. But Joe and Selma have concealed themselves well from the cameras and they remain undetected. And after the meeting, Bella approached Alice, determined to convince her that Little Joe's pollen was infectious, and Bella claimed that Little Joe used its pollen to ensure its propagation as it was sterile and relied on humans to survive. And Bella gave Alice a drive, which upon returning home, Alice discovered had uncut videos on it. And in these videos, people interviewed stated that their family members who had inhaled the pollen weren't really the same after, and they were very worried. And as Alice went upstairs to check on her son, she discovered Joe in his room with Selma. And although initially surprised, Alice invited Selma to stay over for dinner, and during the meal, Joe expressed his desire to live with his father, but Alice refused, causing Joe to storm off the table. And while Alice tried to stop him, he pushed her onto the table, injuring her in the process. And Joe and Selma, who'd been infected with Little Joe's pollen, remained unbothered. And upstairs, the pair tended to the plant and engaged in conversation with it, causing Alice to realize that Joe had neglected his ant colony and was only focused on Little Joe. And Alice then concluded that Bella's claims were in fact true. And at the lab, Bella took it upon herself to destroy the pathogenic plants, and Rick and Chris confront her about it, but she's already suspected something fishy. And later during lunch, Alice confides in Chris about her suspicion that the plant had become pathogenic due to the mutated viral genome used, but Chris dismisses Alice's assumption and he warns her that it could end their careers if they accuse the lab of harboring a human pathogen in a commercial plant. And despite Chris's warning, Alice is still unsure about what to do, and later that day she goes to Joe's school to pick him up, but finds him walking home alone. And he enters her car and he tells her that he didn't actually see her. And during the ride, Alice expresses her concern about his recent behavior, but Joe just brushes it off, saying that he's just growing up. And meanwhile, Rick asks Bella to feed the plants in the evening. And after completing the task, Bella realizes that she was locked inside the room with the pathogenic plants. And the plants release their pollen in the air, and before you know it, Bella inhales all of it. And then the scene cuts to next morning when Alice approaches Bella and asks if she's okay. And Bella confusingly tells Alice that Little Joe is harmless and that she was wrong about everything. And later, Alice visits her psychotherapist and confides in him about what's been really going on in her life. And the therapist suggests that Alice's concern about Joe's behavior indicates her deeply buried need to free herself from the bond that she had with her son. And as Alice returns home, she finds Chris talking to Joe and Selma in the living room, but Alice gets very angry with Chris as he's taken it upon himself to talk to her son, and he confesses his love to her. And Alice, not believing a word that he was saying, decides to kick him out of the house, and then she confronts Joe and Selma about their new sudden change in behavior. And also the break-in at the lab. And Joe reveals that they broke in the lab to acquire Little Joe for Ivan because they also wanted him to be happy. And he also admits that he wanted Alice to join them by inhaling the pollen, but Alice refuses. And Selma tries to convince Alice to inhale the pollen by telling her that she wouldn't notice any differences in personality, and she compares this feeling to death. And this comparison worries Alice, and she later discovers Joe staring into the abyss without any awareness. and after realizing that the plant was producing a pathogenic pollen, Alice approaches the team leader to confess that she was actually using an unapproved gene strain and it requires to have its genome studied and sequenced. And during the sequencing process, Alice notices Bella crying in the laboratory, an action that anyone who's inhaled the pollen wouldn't have done. And Bella confesses during lunch that she was pretending to have inhaled the pollen and that she knew that the others were infected. But Chris and Carl tried to silence her and she ran away, and Alice follows them and she hears a loud thumping noise and she discovers that Bella had fallen from the stairs and is badly injured. And Alice suspects Chris and Carl pushed her off the stairs, but they deny it. And during a gathering of the scientists, Carl informs them what happened with the samples that Alice had collected, and he tells her to discard them since they are pathogen-free. And despite his instructions, Alice realizes that she's not affected by the pathogenic pollen, and she's surprised by this discovery. And she decides to take drastic action by decreasing the temperature of the botanical laboratory to the bare minimum to destroy everything inside the lab. And when Chris realizes what Alice is doing, he attempts to take the keys from her, but she refuses to hand them over. And that's when Chris punches her and he takes the keys, and then he returns the temperature to a comfortable level for little Joe, but he also takes off Alice's mask and he exposes her to the pathogen. And the next morning, Carl calls for a gathering of the scientists. He announces that little Joe has been nominated to be showcased in the upcoming plant showing. And excitement fills the room and Alice turns to Chris and she's still feeling a little embarrassed about their previous encounter, and Chris apologizes and to his surprise, Alice forgives him and she gives him a kiss on the cheek. And this scene reveals that she'd also been affected by the plant's mysterious powers. And later on, Alice visits Joe and tells him that he could live with his father if he chooses to do so. And to reunite Joe with his father, Alice drives him to Ivan's cabin in the woods. And the happy family spends quality time together, and Joe is thrilled to be back with his father. And meanwhile, Alice decides to visit her therapist to discuss her concerns, and she's filled with a sense of purpose and determination to move forward with her work and to take some time for herself. And she believes that this will help her to overcome the challenges that she's facing. And in the final scene of the movie, Alice stands in front of little Joe and she talks to the plant. And as she turns away to leave, she hears a voice that appears to be coming from the plant saying, "Good night, Mum." And this leaves the audience with a sense of unease, wondering what the future holds for little Joe and the people it will affect. And that is how our movie gets concluded. I hope you guys enjoyed our recap. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and most of all, remember to leave a comment. I'll see you guys on my next recap. Bye.